That. Welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed, Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C we call it. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I'm chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches. The legislation, Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act specifically provides for RIPB methods. There's a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB concepts and methods. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of RIPB approaches to share their knowledge and experience. We have scheduled these webinars for the last Friday of every month. Now, today we'll be hearing about the use of, what are, in my mind, similar concepts and methods that are employed or proposed to be employed by NASA. And to me, what it represents is an example of how prescriptive methods have been found to be wanting, and therefore alternatives are being implemented. And we will have Chris Everett from INL making the presentation. So Chris, it's all yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Everett from the Idaho National Lab, and I'm part of a group led by Dr. Homeyoon Desfouli at the NASA Headquarters Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, among many things, helping to modernize NASA spaceflight safety and mission success assurance framework. So I'm going to discuss current efforts around that, and then take your questions. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is basically to summarize the current effort to modernize NASA's assurance framework for safety and mission success. And it sort of has two prongs. You could say one is the definition of the framework itself. And then the second is the development of a standard to implement the framework. And both of these are works in progress, you could say, and don't represent current practice of NASA on the shop floor, so to speak. But we're trying to provide a pull function for a movement in the direction of objectives-driven and case-based, case-assured safety and mission assurance. And the content of this presentation is pretty much a summary of a publicly available white paper of the same name. You can see it in green here. And there's a link you can see to that paper. So that's publicly available. So anyone who's interested can download that and get the information that's contained in there. And further contact or questions, that sort of thing, I would refer you to Dr. Desfouli at the Headquarters Office of Safety and Mission Assurance at NASA. And a disclaimer that basically what I say here is technically my opinion. I'm not speaking for NASA. And the material you're seeing is developmental, so it's not set in stone. It's a work in progress. All right, so in this effort to modernize NASA's Safety and Mission Success Assurance Framework, we established some ground rules. Really, at the top level, NASA acquirers have a duty to be assured that the missions they manage will be safety and successful. So, in a manner of speaking, NASA is the duty holder for the work that it does, regardless of how it acquires that work, whether in-house or from external providers. It's NASA's, in order to put its astronauts at risk and put public at risk, and to put taxpayer dollars towards the objectives of its missions. It needs to develop assurance it can be done successfully and safely. This is reflected in a quote I put in by the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. If you're not all that familiar with NASA and more familiar with nuclear, ASAP is similar to the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board at DOE. So it's oversight, it's congressionally established. And they produce an annual report, basically their assessment of the state of safety at NASA. And one theme that they have very much been emphasizing in recent years is to define how safe is safe enough. What is the acceptable level of risk? And so that speaks directly to what we're calling objectives driven. That's a top level objective for safety. Has to be, they would like to see that explicit, and then one can work within that top level red line, if you want, of acceptable level of risk. And also for NASA acquirers to have confidence, the information they work with has to be technically sound, so that the confidence they have is justified. So basically that gets to the risk-informed aspect of risk acceptance. We want it to be agnostic as well. Prasad talked about standards, prescriptive methods, having problems. They're sort of constraining. They tend to sort of pigeonhole the provider into how things have always been done. They sort of ossify best practices. But an objectives-driven approach is different from that. As long as you can work within the top level objectives, then providers should have the flexibility to innovate and not be constrained. So the principle here is to be process neutral, technology neutral, and even acquisition model neutral. Basically, being constrained by the top level objectives only to the extent possible. Also, when it comes to the acquirer making adequately risk-informed risk acceptance decisions, we wanted the principle that the acquirer should be provided with information that makes it conducive to make that type of decision. That's different from a provider having to, an acquirer having to wade through a data dump of some set of documents and try to make sense of those documents in order to come to the conclusion that they sort of cumulatively or collectively amount to adequate safety. And finally, this is NASA. It has a governance model. It has a system of checks and balances. And whatever we do, the assurance framework we're developing needs to work within that governance model and utilize that system of checks and balances. So with that said, we are developing an assurance framework that is objectives driven and case assured. So we're going to spend a few slides on objectives driven and then a few slides on case assured. And by way of background, NASA historically, and I think pretty much all engineering in general, historically, has taken a largely prescriptive and deliverables-based approach to ensuring safety and mission success likelihood, where prescriptive standards like fault tolerance requirements are levied, or certain analyses are required, whether it's a PRA or FMEA. Certain processes are required. We have NASA has many NASA procedural requirements documents that it follows. So it follows a lot of process. But the limitations of that approach are that they tend to be over-constraining. They tend to stifle innovation. And when things are being done differently, in order to allow that to happen, a lot of tailoring of these prescriptive requirements has to take place. Another piece of the puzzle is that adequate safety is sort of deemed to be achieved by virtue of compliance with these requirements without even necessarily having a clear or idea of how safe it actually is, without actually characterizing the safety directly. And I'm saying safety, I really ought to be saying S&MS performance safety as well as mission success likelihood. So in contrast to that, the framework we're developing starts out with, and is really anchored to what we're calling fundamental safety and mission success objectives that are defined and associated with the fundamental mission objectives. And we have, the next slide has a pictorial representation of that. But that's really just the top level objectives. What are they, and how reliably do they have to be met? And below that, everything below that is really a question of what means are going to be developed to meet those mission objectives at the necessary level of reliability and safety. And that's where we want to have flexibility. So here's a pictorial representation of basically what I just said. On the left, in the blue, are the fundamental mission objectives, and they're sort of the positive objectives of what do you actually want to do, return a sample from the surface of Mars, that sort of thing. This represents success of the mission. And then the sort of the negative objectives of do no harm. You want to protect the crew, you want to protect the public, you want to protect the backwards contamination of Earth in the case of sample return. So that's the safety and mission success part of it, those types of objectives. And then on the right-hand side, associated with each one of those are these fundamental safety and mission success objectives that are really just the probabilistic aspects of the objectives in the blue. Because we can't guarantee with absolute confidence that any mission will meet its fundamental mission objectives. We can only say it will meet it with a certain likelihood. And so the question becomes, well, what is the adequate likelihood to make the endeavor worth doing or safe enough? And so we're proposing this sort of a couplet between the mission objectives and the S&MS objectives at the top level. And so these are fundamental objectives. If you're familiar with the distinction between fundamental objectives and means objectives, fundamental objectives are what stakeholders truly care about. And means objectives, which are the ways that people choose to meet fundamental objectives, aren't cared about for their own sake. They're cared about because they're a means of meeting the fundamental objectives. And we can see on the far left and the far right, the fundamental mission objectives define the desired outcomes, and the fundamental S&MS objectives define the risk posture towards those outcomes. And NASA is moving to really incorporate risk posture into its lexicon and into how it does business. So with that as objectives driven, then case-based or case assured is sort of the flip side of objectives driven. Because if you're giving the acquirer the freedom to choose how the fundamental objectives are achieved, then the burden's sort of on the acquirer to make the case that they have done so. And a case is needed as opposed to sheer compliance, because fundamental objectives are probabilistic and they're non-observable, especially for new systems that don't have a large track record from which you can derive statistics. It's very hard to say for a new system what the probability of loss of crew or probability of loss of mission actually are. There just isn't the data for it. History has shown that for new systems, what we're calling unknown and or unappreciated UU sources of risk have historically been significant and even drivers. Basically, if you understand the risk, hopefully you can hammer it down. Sometimes you don't understand the significance of it, and sometimes you miss it completely. And so those are the things that can bite you, and ultimately, we can point to Challenger and Columbia as being examples of these types of risks. So it's not sufficient to just do an analysis and show that you've identified risks and characterized them. It really is, there's a need to make a very all-encompassing case. So that's where the idea of case comes in. And the case really argues the adequacy of all aspects of the program or project upon which S&MS performance depends over the full scope of its safety management system. So it goes from concept development to design, manufacture, testing, operations, trainings. All these things bear upon safety. And I think many of them can just be lumped under safety management system. But the whole safety management system has to be operating competently and expertly in order to really conclude that a mission is safe enough. It's not a paper exercise. It's really a case about the adequacy of the entire endeavor from the safety and mission success point of view. And then that argument about adequacy has to be substantiated, and so there has to be substantiating evidence, and that evidence isn't just analyses, but there's test results, operational data, audit results. Independent organizations might be doing their own audits, that sort of thing. Plans, are you prepared for upcoming activities, that sort of thing? Do you have change control? All these sorts of things bear upon safety, and really anything that bears upon safety significantly ought to be addressed in an assurance case. So really, an assurance case is a valid argument supported by evidence that substantiates its claims that you're safe enough and mission success is likely enough. And that's what the technical basis is that the acquirer uses to support their risk acceptance decision making. And here's a sort of notional figure of an assurance case. It has a top level claim, it's safe enough for S&MS performance is adequate. The argument structure, there may be many lines of argument and arguments supported by sub-arguments, but ultimately it has to be tied back to evidence. And so that sort of closes anchors the case. So the two main elements of an assurance case are the argument, which includes claims, and the evidence. And then there are formalisms for developing claims. Oh, I think there's an open mic. Anyway, there are formalisms for structuring claims, such as goal structuring notation, or CAE, claims arguments evidence notation, that can be used. I say can be, it's not necessary. You know, a documentary format can be sufficient as well, as long as it's clear and coherent and supported by evidence. And there's a standard, ISO standard 15026, that's in 4 parts that gets into assurance. One of the parts is specifically about assurance cases, but I would recommend all 4 parts because they sort of work together as a group to articulate a case-based approach to assurance. Okay, so although the provider develops the assurance case, its purpose is to satisfy the acquirer's assurance need. So really there's a lot of interaction between a provider and acquirer in this objectives-driven, case-assured approach. And so a lot of it has to do with what counts as a valid safety and mission success argument. And we're not prescriptive about that, what that is, what counts as at a high level as a valid argument. But we do in the white paper and in the draft standard, for illustrative purposes, break it out into these 6 sort of buckets, if you will. You know, the safety and mission success performance needs to be understood, and that understanding has to be within a certain scope of boundaries and assumptions. So basically, we're calling that a normalcy map. You know, there's some limit of normal operation and normal environments within which you understand the performance, and ultimately that performance is acceptable. And then you have to keep the system within that normalcy map, and that's what safety management is really about. Having controls in place and various management processes so that you stay within this controlled and understood region. Safety mission success performance has to meet the minimum tolerable levels that we talked about before, these fundamental S&MS objectives. And also that it's as safe as reasonably practicable. And I'd point back to the NASA System Safety Handbook. It's publicly available. And it talks about adequate safety having 2 pieces. One is meeting minimum tolerable levels, above which it's just too unsafe. But also, regardless of that, and separately from that, missions should be as safe as reasonably practical. And this is basically application of what in other contexts is a LARP or a LARA. Basically, if you can improve safety within practical constraints, you should. That's basically what that is. And so that gets not only just into the system you have, but the system you could have had. So that goes to justifying decisions made with down selects and trade studies, and showing that the selected alternatives are the ones that prioritize safety. And then it's not to say that the acquirer won't levy any deterministic requirements. There may be some requirements that an acquirer feels are necessary, they want to see. And so that's still a part of the framework. And then there's a life cycle perspective that I will be getting to on subsequent slides. So each one of these pillars, a claim about them would sort of have its own argument. So we can see the complexity of a safety case, an S&MS assurance case. Really, the scope of it, it's not just I did an analysis and here's the results. It's very holistic. So here, in sort of a pictorial representation, is a compare and contrast between prescriptive and objectives driven. I won't spend too much time on it, but you can see on the left, prescriptive paradigm begins with prescriptive requirements that sort of codify agency-defined strategies. And it could be using certain standards, could be having certain levels of fault tolerance, doing certain types of analyses. And then they're usually gold-plated because they're intended to cover any magnitude of program or project. So a big initial activity is tailoring these down, either by eliminating or modifying them so that they're actually applicable and to the program or project that's under consideration. So we start with these prescriptive requirements, sort of gold standard requirements. Then there's a tailoring and down to what's agreed upon by the provider and the acquirer. And then the provider goes through their engineering process, and success is defined by compliance with the tailored requirements. And usually that part of those requirements is to produce analyses and things like that. So it produces documentary output. On the right-hand side, which is the objectives-driven, case-assured paradigm, you start with your fundamental S&MS objectives, not with prescriptive requirements. Although this A and B are examples of leaving room for prescriptive requirements if the acquirer does feel that certain things need to be done in a certain way, but that should be kept at a minimum and well justified. And so with that in mind, really basically, for the most part, just the fundamental objectives, S&MS objectives. The provider has the freedom to define its own solution, subject to checks and balances, and we'll get into checks and balances later. And so the baseline requirements, they're not the product of a tailoring activity. They're really the product of the solution definition activity of the provider. So they're really provider driven. And then implementation goes along as well. And then at the end, instead of just having the compliance and documentary evidence that's basically required deliverables, we have the case, the assurance case that has an argument saying why the solution meets the fundamental objectives. There is still compliance because requirements have been levied, and there are still analyses and other kinds of documentary evidence, but they're used as evidence in the argument now. So they're put into a context of what they actually say and what claims they support. So that's sort of pictorially the difference. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little and start talking about addressing S&MS incrementally over the program project lifecycle. There are a couple of NPRs that define the NASA's program project lifecycle. In particular, NPR 7123.1 is NASA's systems engineering processes for space flight. And part of what it talks about life cycle reviews, and part of the life cycle review requirements are to establish success criteria for each life cycle review. So you go into the life cycle review and you know what success looks like. So that's a piece of the existing structure that we are really leveraging in the framework. That's in the S&MS assurance framework, and we'll see that in a bit. But basically, part of establishing the criteria is you have to have a plan, a program-wide plan, and so it splits the activity into the phases. Each phase terminates in a life cycle review. Now, I should caveat that life cycle phases and life cycle reviews are not necessarily one-to-one, but for the purpose of our framework and our standard, pedagogically anyway, we're considering them to be one-to-one, that every phase ends in a life cycle review. But if that's set up correctly, so that the S&MS success criteria do show that you're on track to meeting the top level S&MS objectives, then that allows the activity to be partitioned into phases, and it ultimately will allow the assurance case to be partitioned into phases. And so the assurance case will evolve over the phases. And so it really is a picture of a living assurance case, as opposed to an assurance case that's sort of a deliverable to be produced by the end of the program. And so we'll see graphically some of that. So here graphically, you can see an attempt to compare. On the left is really the life cycle perspective of a program or project, where you start at the very top with the fundamental safety and mission success objectives and any levied deterministic requirements. And the provider will take those and develop a plan for how they'll be satisfied. And the provider's presumptively working within some life cycle model. In the white paper, we have sort of a notional, typical in-house life cycle model of concept development and system design, realization, execution, and closeout. And so the top level activity is a program-wide plan that allocates the plan into the life cycle phases and also defines the success criteria for each phase. And valid success criteria are criteria that basically say that you're on track to meeting your fundamental S&MS objectives. And on the right-hand side, we can see the analog of that in the structure of the S&MS assurance case. The top level claim of the assurance case is that the S&MS objectives are met. And the argument is that you have a plan for meeting them, and the plan is valid. The idea being that if you execute the plan, since it's a valid plan, you will achieve the objectives. So we can see that this initial program-wide planning activity is directly analogous to the top-level arguments of the case, and so that's one thing I think it's important to point out, that the planning activity, the justification for the validity of the plan, is essentially logically identical to the argument of the case. So if you think about case development is not something that can be stovepiped or done later or done by somebody else. It really is an output of planning. It's intimately related to planning. And then we see on the bottom, the columns, each column sort of corresponding to a phase in the life cycle. We see that there are intermediate claims. The success criteria for the life cycles are now intermediate claims. So from the intermediate level up, what you're saying is that if I meet all my success criteria, I meet my top level objectives. And so now the task in any given phase is to meet the S&MS success criteria. And so for a given phase, I don't know if you can see my laser pointer, but here, I'm pointing to phase one and life cycle review success criteria one. If you can show at the life cycle review that you have met the success criteria, and then provide the evidence that substantiates that, then you've met that that subtree or branch of the case, and so you can see how as the program progresses, as you meet these milestones, you're building your assurance case over time. So it's an evolving case. It's a dynamic case. It's intimately related to planning in terms of its argument. The output of each phase includes the production of the evidence that's used to substantiate that you've met your success criteria. So this is sort of the overall high-level program project-wide picture of the case and how it all ties together. I won't spend too much time on these, but in the white paper and in the standard, the draft standard, we have illustrative success criteria for this notional in-house life cycle model. I should point out that the model, it says life cycle model itself, is not necessarily appropriate for things like commercial transportation service acquisition. If we're buying seats on somebody else's rocket that they designed themselves, NASA needs to be assured that astronauts are acceptably safe on that, but they don't do so in the same way that they would if they were developing it themselves in-house. So the life cycle model would have to be different from that. So that's one of the challenges that's currently being worked on. Now I want to talk about what we're calling the W engine for S&MS assurance. That's an engine that operates within each phase. So we sort of had a high-level view of this assurance framework, and so now we're sort of zooming into a given life cycle phase and showing a more detailed view of the assurance framework in terms of this W engine. And again, there's a figure in the next slide, so I'll probably largely speak to it there. But it has three components. One is planning, and I talked about how important planning was and how intimately it's related to the assurance case. And then execution. And then at the end of the phase with the life cycle review is risk acceptance, which generically means that the decision authority has granted the authority to proceed to the next phase. And that's a risk acceptance decision. There's a sufficient confidence that everything is on track to justify continuance. And of course, there may be corrective actions and things like that come out of the review that would be rolled into this decision. But it's still a risk acceptance decision. And I'm not spending much time on it, but technical authority concurrences are sought throughout. If you're not familiar with technical authority at NASA, it's basically part of NASA's independent system of checks and balances. Basically, there are different technical authorities. There's a technical authority for safety mission success that basically provides independent oversight. Okay, so here's a graphical description of the W engine and of the flow of activities that takes place. And basically, you start at the upper left from the program project initialization, sort of that top level of the previous figure we showed before. And you have your success criteria for the phase, and they might need to be adjusted. If you're in some intermediate phase, you've gone through some level of development and you've gotten to a point where you've developed things and things may or may not have gone exactly as you had initially planned. So there's always a need to do an adjustment, a potential need to do an adjustment of criteria so that you start every phase conditional on what has occurred up to that point in previous phases. And of course, you won't have a detailed plan a priori when you do your initial planning, but prior to executing any given phase, you need a detailed plan for that phase. So 2A is development of the detailed plan, and 2B is the S&MS argument for the validity of the plan. So if you're going to get the plan approved, you have to justify why that's a plan that's going to be successful. And that's really, so that's the S&MS argument. And as I mentioned before, that really is logically the same as that piece of the argument of the assurance case that deals with the success criteria for that phase, the S&MS success criteria for that phase. And talked about TA, the technical authority evaluation, independent oversight. We see in the green, the TA has a very active role in this framework. And so the validity of the plan would go through a TA concurrence. And then 4, there's always need for audits and reporting and inspections and things like that. So those are in there. So at the middle of the W at the top is basically when the acquirer approves the plan and grants authority to execute the plan. And this is still within a given phase. And so the right-hand side going down is basically the execution of the plan. And that results at the bottom of the accomplishment of the work of the plan, but also the production of the evidence needed to demonstrate accomplishment of the work of the plan. And also building the assurance case, that piece of the assurance case that speaks to the success criteria for that phase. And again, the TA comes in and evaluates that for soundness. And so that at the top right, that's the life cycle review of the phase, and that's the official forum where the case is made to the decision authority, and the decision is made whether or not to grant authority to proceed. So we see that the decision authority who conducts the life cycle review has a case that's been through independent checks and balances. First through the plan, and then ultimately on the right, the block 8 through the TA evaluation of the case. And then it's on to the next phase. So areas of accountability, I won't spend too much time with this. I've sort of implicitly talked about it. There's an increased burden on the provider to validate its solution. So providers given a lot of freedom and flexibility in this framework. And the flip side of that is that the burden's on them to show the validity of the approach they're taking. Second bullet places an increased burden on the acquirer and the TA and they're called the independent technical review entities here. There's the TA, and then there's a standing review board that participates in the life cycle reviews. But the people that are evaluating the provider, they have the increased burden of understanding the provider's solution, because they're no longer just doing compliance verifications. It's really, they're going to be presented with things that are new, arguments that are new, and so there's a level of rigor and skill and burden placed on the acquirer as well. Let's see. So I think I spoke to the last 2 bullets reasonably. So let me go on. I'm going to skip the next 2. This next 2 slides. These basically just sort of enumerate the roles and responsibilities that are in the white paper and the draft standard when it comes to the acquirer, the provider, and the independent technical review entities. I think we've sort of seen them graphically. The idea being that there's constant interactions throughout the whole process. In particular, that the TAs and the TAs, I guess in particular, I think it's worth noting, are providing independent checks and balances throughout the process. So problems don't lay dormant, hopefully, until it's too late to effectively deal with them. So we talked about how we're developing a standard. It's a draft standard. It's been internally distributed, but it's still in I guess, relatively early days, I suppose you could say. But so we're developing a standard, and this is just talking about that. It's a process standard. So it's not prescribing any particular ways. It's basically just prescribing this framework that we're talking about. And here is a graphical illustration, sort of not only of the standard, but the framework, and it splits out into 3 areas. On the upper left is the setting of objectives. And we can see how it's dominated by the NASA acquirer, whose job it is to define how safe is safe enough and how likelihood of mission success is enough. Then satisfying those objectives is in the middle at the bottom, is really the job of the provider. And so they do that. And you can see at the bottom left is the planning. And there's a lot of emphasis on what's going on in the planning. And then executing, the bottom right, is basically doing the work of the project and producing the evidence. And then conducting the S&MS oversight on the top right is really where the case is reviewed. It's at the conducting the LCRs on the far right. That's basically at the end of every life cycle phase. There's a life cycle review. The TA has an oversight role, and so the TA is there on the right. But the TA's oversight is oversight of basically every box on here. So as the TA's activities are not confined to just one little area, but they're really TAs involved in pretty much everything that's going on. So summary. So there's immediate need to modernize NASA's spaceflight S&MS assurance framework. Motivations for that, there's commercial crew, different model-based systems engineering, basically just the limitations of prescriptive-based, deterministic requirements-based frameworks. So basically we're promoting or developing an objectives-driven, proposing an objectives-driven case-assured framework for S&MS assurance. And that addresses the probabilistic nature of performance in terms of needing a case. It's responsive to the underlying issues, commercialization, evolving technologies and practices, that sort of thing. I guess this summarize that we're consistent. We're staying within the governance model, system of checks and balances, and the overall program project management framework of life cycle phases, success criteria, life cycle reviews. So it's a case that evolves over the phases of the program. So it's an incremental assurance. So at any given time, so it's not, the idea is not that you have a draft assurance case that matures over the project. At every life cycle, the case has to be mature and complete for that moment in time. Because the decision maker at any point in the life cycle has to make a risk acceptance decision based on technically sound, basically mature information. And yes, there are things that are going to occur in the future that haven't happened yet that will bear upon the nature of the case in the future. But it shouldn't be the idea is not that the decision authority needs to work with a draft case because it's in interim status. That's not the picture. The picture is that the case is mature for where it is at every point in time throughout the life cycle. It's the bottom line. So the submittal of an S&MS assurance case at life cycle reviews rather than a document dump that provides a coherent basis for acquire S&MS assurance. And that's pretty much it. Acknowledgments. I guess if I could point you to documents, I'd certainly point you to the white paper of the same title as this presentation. The link is on the first slide. I'd also point you to the NASA System Safety Handbook that has basically it takes an objectives-driven, case-based approach. It's to system safety there, but it really gets into a lot of detail about objectives, fundamental objectives versus means objectives, and structures of the case and the kinds of arguments and how they decompose that one could find in an assurance case. Some of the background information that goes into this, I mentioned the ISO standard on assurance. The UK has required safety cases for quite some time, and they have a defense standard 0056. It's a case-based safety management. And then here's a couple other good sources, external sources that we drew some inspiration from. And for further questions beyond today's presentation, I would refer you to Dr. Descooley at NASA headquarters. And I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. There is a question, I think Greg Hudson asked about applicability to the nuclear industry. And I guess over here, since Bob Youngblood was one of the authors of that white paper, maybe between you and Bob, you can answer the question, where do you see analogs being useful to the nuclear industry?
Well, I defer to Bob on that one.
Well, as fate would have it, I just wrote a conference paper about that, and I think I have just received approval to release it. But I think the mapping is not a slam dunk, and yet I think that elements of it are certainly worthwhile, for different reasons. I think if you look at what happens in NRC space, it looks like it could probably be put into correspondence with the life cycle structure that Chris mentioned. But then if you look at elements of the case, for me, the appeal of the case has always been that it's a coherent narrative instead of the 1,000 submittal picture of the licensing basis that has sort of evolved over time. When NEI 1804 came out and talked about a safety case, I just thought that was wonderful. And I'm not sure that Part 53 is really following in the same spirit, but I'm some days I wonder why not. But anyway, to get back to the micro level, one element of it that comes immediately to mind is that buried in the details of some of the elements of the S&MS assurance case is a program to learn from operating experience. And that's for novel technologies, and a lot of what NASA does is truly novel technologies. That just seems like a very worthwhile thing to be doing, assuming that it's not just a one-shot mission. And it comes to mind because in recent Part 53 discussions, there was a paragraph in draft Part 53 that wanted a facility safety program, and industry objected because staff hadn't articulated a reason for it. So I think that there are a lot of interesting and specific comparisons to be made. The institutional piece, is more involved than to say it's not. I'd be foolish to rush in and just give a flip answer to that. But maybe it's worth noting that the first instance of safety case anywhere, as far as I know, was in the UK for nuclear installations. So, that's not where most of the world has used it, but that is where it popped up first. Maybe I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks, Bob. Let's see, we have just a couple of minutes. If anybody else wants to unmute and ask a quick question, you're welcome to do so. We do try to end on time, but I have lots of questions, but not enough time really to pursue them. If there are no more questions, I'll thank Chris, for the presentation. And I think Bob made the connection to what's going on in Part 53, and that's very much on my mind also. How we get anything to happen over there is a different matter, but we can pursue that separately. So again, thank you all for attending, and appreciate your participation, and please do come back, or I hope the next last Friday of June. Don't know the date, but Chris, thank you again very much. And Pat, thank you also. And we can now close it.